Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this 4th of July edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and I'll be hosting today's show once again. First here, fire danger graphic for the 4th of July, and compared to last year, it's a lot less in the way of fire danger than what we saw 1 year ago with the heat wave, especially over southern Alaska. Anyway, today, we've got a couple areas of extreme, really nothing that's widespread, but up there over the southern slopes of the eastern Brooks Range. Otherwise, into the Yukon Flats, it's high to very high, and an area also extends in the Koyukuk Valley, then a break, and then another area that's not as high. I'd call it high without the very high there over the north slope, and then extending across the western Brooks Range. Otherwise, southern Sitna Valley, of course, with the temperatures in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, we've seen the last couple of days, fire danger elevating across the Anchorage, Palmer, Madanuska, the Sitna Valley area, and also in the Copper River Basin, and now over toward the, looks like Northway Toke area. And from there, looking at the hazardous weather graphic, the red area there, Copper River Basin, is red, and that's due to what we call a red flag warning. And that's due to the elevated fire danger that will result from some lightning activity that's expected across the area, to be scattered across the area, mostly during the evening hours. And so due to that, that's pushed the fire danger up to something higher than what was shown on the previous graphic there. And also over the Panhandle, that's an area of elevated fire danger, or signifying an area of elevated fire danger from what it was when it was cooler and damper. Of course, sun comes out and that warms and dries things out, and the fire danger elevates, and that's what's going on over there. So moving on to satellite imagery, we've got, again, a weak front out over the Bering Sea, slowly moving eastward there with an area of light rain. Did bring 1/4 inch of precipitation to Adak, and then lighter amounts, but it's pretty narrow. It's just moving on to the Pribilof Islands currently. And otherwise, another sunny, warm day, especially southern Alaska, as well as up in the interior, Copper River Basin, Kenai Peninsula. But the warmest temperatures recorded occurred in south central Alaska. It's the Sitna Valley. Butte had 83 degrees this afternoon. Warm spots were at Big Lake, 85. Thunderbird Falls, 85 degrees, which is a rather hot parking lot if you've ever been there. And farther to the south, Nilchik had 80 degrees at mid-afternoon. And Copper River Basin mostly in the 70s, but Chitina had 84, normally warm location there. And dry across the Panhandle with some varying amounts of clouds. Also, you can see some clear skies up over the upper Yukon Valley, northern Koyukuk Valley. And actually, there was some clearing out all the way out to the Arctic coast in some areas, but lots of clouds out over the Bering Sea. There was some clearing also, came across the Fox Islands today. And the gradient in advance of that front was strong enough gradient that the winds kicked up to 50 miles an hour in gusts at Cold Bay, with Cape Newenham reporting 35-mile-an-hour wind gusts, and gusts there at St. George, St. Paul in the 25 to 35-mile-per-hour range. So that front weakening, but it's a little bit more of a wind than precipitation producer, and will continue to wash out as it progresses eastward with the low center, the main low center, farther back to the west. On the chart today, some isolated thunderstorm strikes at early to mid-afternoon showing up over the central Alaska range, and then up north of the White Mountains, sort of into the southern upper Yukon Valley, and then extending along a trough there across Eagle to the east, but nothing widespread, at least at this time yet. And also some convection starting to pop up over the Copper River Basin, which is expected to develop into some thunderstorm activity, especially this evening. And otherwise, low clouds and fog Gulf of Alaska in toward the southeast coast. Some isolated showers did pop up over the eastern border of the Panhandle, especially southern areas, but pretty scattered nature. And a couple of troughs kept it, again, windy and damp over the Alaska Peninsula, as well as areas along the southwest coast. And then the main front farther to the west with a more solid area of light rain, fog, and drizzle with it, and then dry behind that. And looking at tonight's forecast, look for the shower activity to diminish after midnight over the Copper River Basin, but will persist, say, northern Copper River Basin, eastern Alaska range, possibly into the 40-mile country. Otherwise, everywhere else will be variably cloudy and dry, the exception being the southwest interior with that weak trough pushing inland, light rain and drizzle expected along that, all the way down into northeast Bristol Bay. There'll be less of it there, and a little dry over the Alaska Peninsula, and that front really dissolving as it pushes eastward, but keeping a band of light rain, fog, and drizzle with it, and then a little bit higher pressure behind that for light winds and considerable low clouds and fog over the central Bering Sea that extends westward to the Komodorskis, northward through the Bering Strait, and areas of the Arctic coast. And for tomorrow, Sunday, thermal low up over the northern interior. Possible isolated shower may pop up over the Brooks Range there in the west, but generally dry and temperatures back into the 70s. I don't think there'll be too much in the way of any 80s showing up tomorrow, and it'll be definitely cooler for the Susitna Valley and south central Alaska area, with temperatures still getting into the 70s, but forget the 80s. And some areas likely stuck in the upper 60s, especially where there's more clouds and a better chance of showers in the afternoon. Thunderstorms possible Copper River Basin up toward Eagle, and it looks kind of wet over the southern Panhandle, a little cooler. And that front, again, really washing out as it makes landfall along the southwest coast and pushes in toward western Bristol Bay on up to the Bering Strait. Outlook for Monday. Again, not much change in that thunderstorm pattern, nothing widespread or really of significant nature, mostly from the northeastern Copper River Basin and the eastern interior. Otherwise, scattered showers, cloudy, cooler south central Alaska. Call it mostly cloudy with scattered showers. Become more numerous, though, western Cook Inlet across the southern Kuskokwim Valley toward Lake Iliamna on into northeast Bristol Bay, and showers extend along that trough, extending north-northwestward along the northwest coast into the Noatak Valley. Low clouds and fog, and a little breezy with those, could get a little gusty on the east winds on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. High pressure over the Fox Islands, and some moisture sliding northeastward around that. Look for a chance of rain to slide into St. Lawrence Island late in the day, but dry along the southwest coast. And a couple of twin lows in the Gulf of Alaska really don't affect the area much at all, but look for showers over the Panhandle. Lows for tonight, lower to mid-30s along the eastern Arctic coast, otherwise mid-50s over the southwest interior, lower 50s Alaska Peninsula, mid-50s south central Alaska, 40s to 50s everywhere else. Highs for tomorrow, cooler, 65 to 75 now, south central Alaska, even cooler in the Copper River Basin, but still well into the 70s up in the interior, and 60s for the Panhandle, 50s out west, and 45 to 65 there along the Arctic coast and North Slope. And then the lows following morning, not much different, although cooler for the southwest coast, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Otherwise, just 40s and 50s about sums it up for everywhere. And then highs cooler yet, staying in the 60s now for south central Alaska, lower 70s up in the central interior, lower 40s in the Arctic coast, but still 60s along the Panhandle and 50s for the Alaska Peninsula.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And moving into flying weather, Sunday morning, IFR off the Arctic coast there, with marginal VFR along the coastline, down along the northwest coast in toward Kotzebue Sound, and then IFR inland from the coast over the Kuskokwim Yukon Delta areas, eastward to about Dillingham, marginal VFR east of there, across the Aleutian Range, King Salmon, south of Lake Iliamna, east side of Kodiak Island, IFR up the west side of Kodiak, right on up into Prince William Sound, and then remaining off the southeast coast, but the Panhandle rather marginal, VFR in the interior. And for Sunday afternoon, that area of IFR out over the western Bering Sea advances eastward to and past the Pribilofs and is covering the western half of the Aleutians, but mostly marginal with some scattered IFR for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, mostly IFR. IFR for the southwest coast, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, right up to the Kuskokwim Mountains, and IFR through the Bering Strait, right up to Point Hope and possibly Cape Lisburne. Otherwise, marginal VFR in toward probably not quite reaching the Noatak Valley, and IFR, again, right along or just off the central and eastern Arctic coast. IFR for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, eastward to Yakutat. VFR for the Panhandle, VFR over the interior from northern Cook Inlet on up to the North Slope. And for Monday morning, a real deterioration of conditions with ceilings and visibilities down, one or both into the IFR category for Cook Inlet, much of the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, into the Talkeetnas, portions of the western Copper River Basin, the Kuskokwim Valley, western Alaska Range, most of the southwest interior as well, and then up across Norton Sound, western Seward Peninsula, VFR north of the Alaska Range to the Brooks Range, and then IFR eastern Arctic coast, solid IFR for the Bering Sea, and mostly solid IFR for the Aleutians as well. And then for the afternoon, we've got IFR again over the Bering Sea. See some improvement there just west of the Pribilofs, and marginal VFR, Adak and especially Atka, otherwise IFR for the Fox Islands. And then we've got VFR on the south side of the Alaska Peninsula, and mostly VFR across southern Alaska and the southwest portion of the state, with IFR, western Cook Inlet, the Alaska Range, spilling into the Kuskokwim Valley with VFR flying conditions, Copper River Basin, and much of the mid and upper Yukon River Valley zone and flats area, North Slope looking good, and Panhandle VFR. For passes Anatuvik and Adigan for tomorrow, Sunday, all VFR, good flying. VFR continues, Lake Clark and Merrill, and rainy as well. VFR flying on either approach, windy VFR, and wide open for Isabel and Mentasta. Risk of a thunderstorm for Mentasta, northern entrance in the afternoon, but really thunderstorms not much of a factor again for the day Sunday. And Tanita looks mostly, hopefully, VFR optimistically. The marginal VFR will stay off to the south. And for Portage, IFR, eastern entrance, otherwise looking at pretty marginal conditions throughout the entire day. Chilkoot and White, VFR. Freezing levels, warm air aloft, upper ridging there, just south of the Alaska Peninsula, 14,000 feet, barely hanging onto the map at 12,000 feet, all the way up to St. Lawrence Island, kind of a cold pool there over the Mackenzie River Delta area, and then cooler out over the west central Bering Sea. Icing, not really anything too serious. Greatest potential there, areas of rime of the light variety over the southwest interior, and kind of a mixed situation there for the Copper River Basin and the Panhandle, but nothing really too serious at all. And for jet stream, westerly flow across the southern Bering into the coast, and then takes a turn back to the northwest with the upper level ridge over the west central interior, and northerly flow farther to the east now, coming down from the Arctic all the way into the northeast Gulf of Alaska. 9,000 foot wind flow chart showing low pressure over the Russian Far East, and strongest winds staying out to the west and even north of the Aleutians. Lighter winds over the interior with high pressure as well as the southwest coast, and then upper level low of that cold air aloft over the Mackenzie River Delta and Bay area. Kicking the winds up there, especially along the eastern Arctic coast, possibly Brooks Range, but not all that strong. And about the same pattern at 3,000 feet, basically high pressure more or less for light variable winds over the interior. Strongest winds over the western Aleutians and Bering Sea, but not that strong. That'll translate to light to isolated moderate chop at Chitka, Kiska, Shimmy, and Attu, as well as the eastern Beaufort Sea coast below 4,000 feet.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather, growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York, and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms, why they occurred. The distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region, the rain-snow line. all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense and what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. You know, there are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas, we have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. Well, one of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, you know, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors: big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're deriving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Today's sea ice analysis. Again, not really noticeably different from yesterday. A little less ice on the western Arctic coast. And outlook for the next several days, really no big changes anticipated, just the ice field shifting around with the prevailing wind direction. From there, going to coastal water forecast along the southeast coast. The entire stretch of the coastline there, winds will be southeast, 10 to maybe 15 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. Clarence Strait, southeast at 10. Stevens Passage, south at 10. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, northern inside waters, south 15 knots with 3 foot seas. And for Monday, light west winds on the north coast with 4 foot seas, and then northwest breeze, 10 to 15 knots on the south coast with 5 foot seas. And Clarence Strait, light southwest winds at 10, and Stevens Passage, light southerlies at 10, as well as light south winds for Lynn Canal, and seas no more than 2 feet. Prince William Sound, variable to east winds tomorrow at 10 knots with slight seas, and variable winds at 10 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Seas down to 3 feet, southeast 15 with 3 foot seas also for the Barren Islands. Kamishak Bay into southern Cook Inlet. Winds will be southerly, sustained at 20 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas, but north of the Forelands, southwest 15. Outlook for Monday, west winds at 10 for northern Cook Inlet and southern Cook Inlet, southwest 15. Kamishak Bay, southerlies at 20 knots, northeast 15 there for the Barren Islands. West winds 10 knots for the North Gulf Coast, as well as Prince William Sound with 4 to 5 foot seas there out along the North Gulf Coast and staying pretty slight over the Prince William Sound area. And for Shelikof Strait tomorrow, southwest winds at 15 knots. East side of Kodiak Island to Castle Cape, looking at southwest winds at 20 knots with 5 foot seas. Lighter though, Castle Cape to Cape Sarachev, winds will be southwest at 10, but seas will be 10 feet. And then on the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, look for westerlies at 15, becoming southwest at 15 for Bristol Bay. Those will be 20 knots for Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, as well as Kodiak Island, including Shelikof Strait, so west 20, all areas with seas running 4 to 6 feet. For Sunday, eastern Aleutians, West-northwest, 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 6 foot seas. And the central Aleutian, southwest 15 to 20 knots. Small craft advisories from Amchitka westward to Shimianatu, sustained at 25 knots with 7 to 10 foot seas. Those drop off a little bit, get under the small craft advisory threshold anyway, and become southeast at 20 knots. South-southeast 20 knots for Adakanatka. And the Fox Islands, a little more squirrely there with directions from southeast to southwest, and the speeds ranging from 10 to 20 knots, and the seas 5 to 7 feet. Southwest coast, southwest winds 15 knots. Pribilof, southwest winds 15 knots. St. Matthew Island, southwest winds 15 knots. St. Lawrence Island, southwest winds at 15 knots. But Norton Sound, the standout, looking at easterlies at 10 knots with 2 foot seas. Outlook for Monday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, west 15, otherwise west-southwest 20 knots for the Pribilof, St. Matthew Island, and the southwest coast. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, northwest 10 on the east side, northerlies at 10 on the east central coast, but east of 15 for the central coast, picking up to 20 knots on the west side, and then 10 to 15 knot winds from Wales up to Cape Beaufort out of the east. And then for Monday, small craft advisories there for the western coast at 25 knots from an easterly direction. Otherwise, central and eastern Arctic coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots. And then from Wales to Cape Thompson, winds will be southwest at 15 with 3 foot seas. Looking at the forecast tonight, the interior pretty much dry with light winds and variably cloudy skies, but it'll be mostly cloudy with showers continuing through the night over the northern Copper River Basin after some thunderstorm activity this evening and into the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country. Otherwise, a weak trough keeps some clouds and drizzle and light rain over the southwest interior to the Alaska Peninsula, and mostly cloudy for the Panhandle. And that front washes out to just a very weak trough on Sunday as it hits the southwest and west coast. Otherwise, cooler over the interior, but still into the 70s, especially the central and northern interior. Minimal risk of thunderstorms, kind of damp over the southern southeast coast. Outlook for Monday, more widespread shower activity for the Panhandle, and cooler, cloudier, and a better chance of showers southern Alaska. 70s again in the central and northern interior.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal, pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.